Bleach smells like forgiveness in a hospital. It smells like second chances, like a clean slate scrubbed over whatever happened the night before. But underneath the bleach, if you know how to listen with your nose, there's always something else. Copper, sweat. Fear sweat is different from regular sweat. Sharper, more acidic. The kind that seeps out of a body that knows something is wrong before the brain admits it. Marcus Webb had learned to separate those two smells a long time ago, in a place that didn't have a name on any map the State Department would admit to. Now he separated them in the ICU of Ashford Memorial Hospital, on the overnight shift, where nobody noticed him do it. He was 38 years old, 6'2", built like a man who used to run with 80 pounds of gear on his back and had never quite let his body forget it, though he kept his shoulders rounded and his voice low enough that most people looked right through him. He wore his scrubs a size too big, the same way some men wear oversized coats to disappear into a crowd. His hands were enormous, careful, slow, deliberately slow, the kind of slow that civilian staff mistook for hesitation, when in fact, it was the opposite. It was a man who had learned, in the worst rooms on earth, that fast hands kill people. Precise hands save them. To the staff of Ashford Memorial, Marcus was the quiet one. The black nurse who said yes ma'am and no problem, and never once raised his voice. Never once corrected a doctor in front of a patient. Never once asked for credit. He was reliable in the way furniture is reliable. He showed up. He did the unglamorous work. He left. Nobody invited him to the holiday party planning committee. Nobody asked where he'd gone to nursing school, because the truth was, nobody had bothered to look at his file closely enough to notice that the dates didn't quite line up. That there were 4 years unaccounted for between the end of his undergraduate degree and the start of his nursing credentials. 4 years that, if anyone had pulled the right thread, were sealed under a classification most hospital administrators didn't know existed. He liked it that way. He had built that invisibility brick by brick, the same way he'd once built overpressure seals on a containment tent in 90 seconds flat, hands moving on muscle memory, while his mind stayed 3 steps ahead of a clock that didn't care about his feelings. Invisibility was armor. Invisibility meant nobody asked him to remember. Dr. Renata Cole, the attending on nights, was not unkind to Marcus. Exactly. She simply didn't see him as a resource. She saw him as a body that filled a shift. She was 34, brilliant in the narrow, blinding way that academic medicine rewards, and she had the particular impatience of someone who had never once, in her entire career, been forced to operate without the safety net of a fully stocked trauma center humming quietly around her. When she gave Marcus instructions, she gave them the way you'd give instructions to an intern, slow and over-enunciated, even though Marcus had been a nurse for 9 years and had forgotten more about critical care than half the residents currently rotating through her unit. Webb, I need you to draw labs on bed 6 and chart vitals on 4 and 5, and please, for the love of God, don't let bed 6's family corner you again about the discharge timeline. I don't have the bandwidth tonight. Understood, Marcus said, in the flat, even voice he used for everything. He never argued. He never explained that he could read a chart in 4 seconds that would take her 2 minutes, or that his hands had once threaded a chest tube into a man's collapsing lung in a blacked-out transport plane somewhere over a border that technically didn't exist, by feel alone. No light, mortar fire rattling the fuselage like a drum. He just nodded and went to draw labs. It was a Tuesday night in late October when the first patient came in, and nothing about it seemed unusual at first. A man in his 50s, construction worker, brought in by his wife with what looked like a brutal stomach flu, fever, vomiting, diffuse abdominal pain, and a faint, almost imperceptible rash beginning to bloom across his forearms, small red dots like a fine spray of paint. Dr. Cole diagnosed him with gastroenteritis, prescribed fluids and antiemetics, and moved on to the next bed, because the ER was loud and full, and nobody had time to linger on a man who, by every conventional metric, looked like he had a bad case of food poisoning. Marcus was the one who hung the IV bag. He was the one who, while checking the man's pulse, noticed that his hands were trembling not from fever, but from something else. A fine, rhythmic tremor that lived in the nervous system, not the muscles. He was the one who lifted the man's gown to check the rash, and felt something cold drop through his chest, a sensation he hadn't felt in 6 years, a sensation his body remembered before his mind caught up to it. The rash wasn't random. It was following the path of the man's lymphatic drainage, spreading outward from 2 points of origin, both on the inside of his forearms, both small, both almost invisible unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. Puncture marks, not from an IV. Too small, too clean, too deliberately placed. Marcus didn't say anything, not yet. He had learned, in the field, that the worst thing you could do with a half-formed suspicion was scream it into a crowded room and watch the panic metastasize faster than the actual threat. He had learned that the first 30 minutes of any outbreak were the most important 30 minutes of the entire response, and that those 30 minutes belonged to quiet, careful observation, not noise. So he charted the rash. He noted the tremor. He drew an extra vial of blood without telling anyone why, and he tucked it into his scrub pocket instead of sending it through the normal lab pipeline, because something in his gut, the same gut that had kept him alive through things he never talked about, told him that whatever this was, it needed to be looked at by someone who actually knew what they were looking for. By 2 a.m., 3 more patients had come in with the same presentation: fever, vomiting, the rash, in 2 of them already spreading along the same lymphatic pathways. By 3 a.m., the construction worker's wife was crying in the hallway because her husband had stopped responding to his name, and the monitors over his bed were screaming in a rhythm that made even Dr. Cole's composed face go pale. "I don't understand," she said, more to herself than to anyone else, staring at the chart. "His labs don't make sense. His white count is climbing, but it's not septic shock. It's not meningitis. The LP was clean." She looked up and her eyes landed on Marcus, who was standing very still at the foot of the bed, watching the patient's breathing with an intensity that, for the first time in 9 years, she actually noticed. "Webb, what?" "Ma'am, I think you should isolate this patient." "And the other 3? "Isolate them from what? We don't even have a diagnosis." Marcus hesitated, just for a half second, the kind of hesitation that lives in the space between 2 lives. The life he'd built here, quiet and small and safe, and the life he'd buried, loud and enormous and soaked in things he didn't let himself remember in daylight. The rash pattern. It's not viral exanthem, it's lymphatic spread from a point source, 2 point sources, on his forearms. I think he was exposed to something, deliberately or not, through a skin vector, and I think it's moving fast enough that if we don't contain it in the next hour, we're going to have a hospital-wide problem. Dr. Cole stared at him the way you'd stare at a vending machine that had suddenly started reciting Shakespeare. "Webb, that's a very specific theory for a med-surg nurse." "I could be wrong," Marcus said, already retreating back into the flat, unassuming cadence he used to survive each day at Ashford Memorial. "But I'd rather be wrong and cautious than right and unprepared." She didn't isolate the patients, not yet. She ordered a broader infectious disease panel, paged the on-call ID specialist, and told Marcus, not unkindly, but with the particular condescension of someone who believed credentials were the only thing that conferred competence, that she appreciated his concern, but that they needed to let the actual diagnostic process run its course before they started locking down a hospital wing on a nurse's hunch. Marcus said understood and went back to charting vitals, and underneath the flat stillness of his face, something old and cold was waking up. He had felt this exact shape of dread exactly once before in his life, 6 years ago, in a converted grain warehouse outside a city he was never allowed to name in any after-action report, where he had watched 11 of the 12 people on his team die over the course of 71 hours, from something that didn't have a name yet either, something that moved through skin contact and aerosolized in the final stage, something that the United States government had spent considerable resources making sure the public never heard about. He was the 12th person. He was the only one who walked out, and the reason he walked out wasn't luck. It was knowledge. 3 years of specialized training in exactly the kind of pathogen that had just, impossibly, terrifyingly, walked through the front doors of a civilian hospital in Ohio wearing the face of a construction worker's stomach flu. By 4:30 a.m., the construction worker was dead. The cause of death on his initial chart would say cardiac arrest, secondary to unknown systemic infection. But Marcus, standing in the hallway outside the room with his hands pressed flat against the cool plaster wall, knew it wasn't unknown at all. He knew exactly what it was. He had just never expected to see it again outside of a nightmare. He found Dr. Cole in the staff lounge, drinking burnt coffee with the kind of exhausted, glassy stare that comes after watching a patient die from something you can't explain. He closed the door behind him, which was, in itself, the first unusual thing he had ever done in 9 years at that hospital. "Doctor, I need you to listen to me, and I need you to not ask me how I know what I'm about to tell you, because I genuinely cannot answer that question. And the answer is classified at a level that would get both of us in a room with people who don't wear hospital badges." Dr. Cole set down her coffee. Something in his voice had changed. The flat, deferential cadence was gone, replaced by something low and precise, and utterly without hesitation, the voice of a man who was used to being listened to, and had simply, for 9 years, chosen not to use it. "That patient didn't die of an unknown infection," Marcus said. "He died of a weaponized hemorrhagic agent that I have personally seen before, in a containment failure that killed 11 people I served with. It's called, in the unclassified shorthand we were given, ferox. It doesn't exist in any medical textbook because the people who created it didn't want it to exist anywhere a textbook could find it. It has a 72-hour kill window from first exposure if untreated, and somewhere around hour 40, it stops being contagious through fluid contact and starts becoming airborne. We are currently sitting at, by my count, hour 6 since the index patient walked through your doors. That gives us roughly 34 hours before this hospital becomes a sealed coffin for everyone inside it." Dr. Cole's mouth opened and closed twice before anything came out. "Webb, I need you to explain to me right now how a med-surg nurse from a community hospital in Ohio knows the name of a classified bioweapon." "Because I wasn't always a med-surg nurse," Marcus said quietly. "I spent 6 years assigned to a joint special pathogens unit that doesn't appear on any organizational chart you've ever seen. We responded to containment breaches, recovered samples, and treated exposures in the field, off the books, in places the United States officially never operated. 6 years ago, in a warehouse I'm not allowed to tell you the location of, our containment failed during a recovery operation. 12 of us went in. I was the only one who came out. I survived because of something in my blood chemistry that the doctors who debriefed me never fully explained to me, and because I knew, second by second, exactly what stage of the infection I was in, and exactly what to do about it. I have spent the last 6 years trying very hard to never think about any of this again. I am thinking about it now because 4 people in this hospital are dying of it, and you are the only physician in this building who I can tell, and you are looking at me like I just told you I'm an alien." The silence in the staff lounge stretched long enough that the coffee machine's gurgle felt deafening. Dr. Cole studied his face, really studied it, for the first time in the 2 years they had worked the same unit together, and saw, underneath the tired, deferential mask he wore every single shift, something rigid and enormous, and entirely calm in the face of a catastrophe she could not yet fully comprehend. It was the calm of a man who had already lived through the worst version of this exact night. "If you're right," she said slowly, "we need to lock this floor down immediately. We need the CDC. You need to do exactly what I tell you, in exactly the order I tell you, starting right now," Marcus said. And for the first time, Dr. Cole did not argue. The next 2 hours moved like a fever dream. Marcus, still in his oversized scrubs, still wearing the same quiet face the nursing staff had overlooked for 9 years, became something none of them had ever seen. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He moved through the ICU with the terrifying economy of a man executing a plan he had run 1,000 times in his head, sealing off the East Wing using portable negative pressure barriers that the hospital had, by sheer institutional luck, purchased after a pandemic preparedness grant 5 years earlier and never actually deployed. He pulled 3 other nurses aside, not the senior staff, but the ones he had quietly clocked over the years as sharp, unflustered, capable under pressure, and gave them instructions in a low, clipped voice that made all 3 of them straighten their spines without quite understanding why. "Sarah, I need you on PPE discipline. Nobody goes in or out of that wing without a full barrier suit, properly sealed, properly doffed. You check every single person, no exceptions, including me. Tomas, I need a manual log of every staff member and visitor who has been within 15 feet of any of the 4 index patients in the last 6 hours. Names, times, duration of contact. Priya, find me every vial of doxycycline and every broad-spectrum antiviral this hospital has in stock. And don't ask me why. Just do it, because in about 4 hours I am going to need it, and there will not be time to explain." Dr. Cole watched him work and felt something shift inside her professional understanding of the world. The quiet, bone-deep recalibration of someone realizing that competence does not always announce itself loudly, that the most dangerous person in a room is sometimes the one nobody bothered to ask a single real question. By 7 a.m., hospital administration had been notified, and by 7:40, the first calls had gone out to the county health department, who, upon hearing Marcus's precise clinical description of the pathogen's behavior, a description far too specific and far too confident to have come from any standard medical training, escalated the call directly to a federal biohazard response line that very few civilians even knew existed. The wheels of an apparatus much larger than Ashford Memorial Hospital had begun turning, quietly, urgently, somewhere far above the heads of the exhausted night shift nurses scrubbing into hazmat gear in a supply closet that had never been designed for this. It was nearly 9 a.m. when the convoy arrived. Not ambulances, black SUVs and a single unmarked box truck, moving with the kind of disciplined, silent urgency that has nothing to do with traffic laws and everything to do with protocols written in rooms with no windows. They didn't use the main entrance. They came through the loading dock, 6 men and 2 women in full Level A hazmat suits, moving with the synchronized precision of people who had trained for exactly this scenario more times than they could count. And at the front of them, barking instructions into a throat mic, was a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a gray buzz cut and a face like a closed fist. Dr. Cole, half panicked, half relieved, moved to intercept them at the loading dock doors, her own improvised PPE crinkling around her. "I'm Dr. Cole. I'm the attending physician. I need to brief you on." The man in the lead didn't slow down. "Where's Webb?" Dr. Cole stopped mid-sentence. "I'm sorry, who?" "Marcus Webb. 6'2", black male, late 30s, would have identified the pathogen by name within the first hour, because nobody else on the planet outside our unit knows what Ferox actually does to a host. Where is he?" Behind the visor of his hazmat hood, the man's eyes were sharp, urgent, almost frightened, in a way that didn't match the rest of his bearing. Dr. Cole, completely disoriented, pointed down the corridor toward the sealed East Wing, where Marcus was visible through the observation window, moving between 2 patients with the calm, terrible focus of a man doing exactly the job he was born for. The man in the hazmat suit, whose name patch, visible now beneath the suit's clear panel, read Holloway, stopped at the observation window, and stared through the glass for a long moment, his shoulders dropping an inch, as though some enormous weight he had been carrying for 6 years had just, finally, been set down. "I'll be damned," Holloway said quietly. "Spectre's alive." Dr. Cole turned sharply. "Spectre? That's not a name you say out loud, ma'am. Not even here," Holloway said, already moving toward the doffing station to suit up properly. "But yeah, that's him. We listed him KIA 6 years ago." Closed the file. Wrote letters to a mother who buried an empty casket because the army couldn't tell her the truth about where her son died or how. And he's been standing in your hospital this whole time, drawing blood and charting vitals, and not one of you people thought to ask him a damn thing about himself. The words landed on Dr. Cole like a physical blow, and somewhere behind her composed, exhausted face, the memory of every dismissive instruction she had ever given him. Draw labs on bed 6. Don't let the family corner you. I appreciate your concern, but let the actual diagnostic process run its course. Rose up and curdled into something close to shame. Inside the sealed wing, Marcus heard the commotion before he saw it. He recognized Holloway's voice through 2 layers of negative pressure barrier and a decade of trying very hard to forget it. And for 1 full second, his hands, the same hands that had just placed a precision IV line into a crashing patient's jugular without a single tremor, went still. He had not seen Holloway since the debrief. Since the small windowless room where 3 men in suits had explained to him, in careful bureaucratic language, that his entire team's deaths would be recorded as a transport accident, that his own survival would be quietly buried in a classified annex, that he would be offered a generous severance, a new identity in the medical field he'd trained in before the army ever found him, and a single, very clear instruction: never speak of this again, to anyone, for the rest of his life. He had taken that deal. He had built 9 years of careful, deliberate invisibility on top of it. And now the past was standing on the other side of a containment barrier, suited up in level A protective gear, asking for him by a call sign he hadn't heard spoken aloud since the worst 71 hours of his entire life. Holloway suited up and stepped through the airlock himself, ignoring the protests of 2 younger agents who insisted the senior commander shouldn't be the one entering an active hot zone. He crossed the ICU floor and stopped 3 feet from Marcus, and for a long moment neither man said anything at all. The monitors beeped their indifferent rhythm around them. Somewhere behind the glass, Dr. Cole and the rest of the staff watched in stunned, silent confusion as the most powerful man in the building stood at attention in front of the quiet night shift nurse nobody had ever bothered to really see. "You let us bury you, Spectre," Holloway said, his voice rough behind the suit's filtered speaker. "I needed to be buried," Marcus said. "It was the only way I knew how to stop hearing them. You knew it was Ferox before our lab confirmed it. You locked this wing down on instinct alone, and saved God knows how many lives doing it. Containment specialists train for years to recognize a Ferox presentation this fast, and you did it in an ER with no equipment, on a hunch, after 6 years out of the field." "It wasn't a hunch," Marcus said, and for the first time since the conversation began, his composure cracked just slightly, just enough to let something raw show through. "I dream about that rash pattern at least once a month. I know it better than I know my own reflection. I just never thought I'd see it again outside my own head." Holloway looked past him, into the bed where the dying patient lay stabilizing under Marcus's care, vitals climbing back toward something survivable because of decisions Marcus had made in the absence of any official authority, any backup, any acknowledgement that he had ever been trained to do any of it. "We need you, Webb, officially this time. No more pretending you don't exist. The antiviral protocol you developed in the field after your unit's exposure, that's the only documented survival case we have on record for this agent. We need your blood. We need your knowledge. We need you back." Marcus looked down at his hands, steady now, the same hands that had quietly, anonymously, saved 4 lives in the last 6 hours, without a single person in this hospital understanding what they were actually witnessing. He thought about 9 years of being overlooked, 9 years of "don't let the family corner you," 9 years of building himself small enough to disappear inside a job everyone assumed was the limit of what he could do. "I'll help you contain this," Marcus said finally. "I'll give you everything I know about Ferox, every protocol, every treatment window, all of it. But I'm not disappearing back into a black site afterward. If I'm doing this, I'm doing it as a nurse who happens to know something terrible, not as a ghost you dust off when it's convenient." Holloway studied him for a long moment, then nodded, slow and respectful, the closest thing to an apology a man like him knew how to give. "Understood, Spectre. Webb, whatever you want to be called." By that evening, the outbreak had been fully contained. No further patients developed symptoms, thanks to the speed of the lockdown Marcus had initiated hours before federal teams ever arrived, and the treatment protocol he dictated from memory, drawn from his own desperate, half-remembered survival 6 years earlier, pulled all 3 remaining patients back from the edge of multi-organ failure. The construction worker, tragically, could not be saved. He had simply been exposed too early, his case too advanced, before anyone understood what they were fighting. But 3 families who would have buried someone that week did not have to, and not one of them would ever know the name of the quiet nurse who made that possible. Because the official report, like so many official reports involving Marcus Webb, would never mention him by name at all. Dr. Cole found him afterward in the same staff lounge where he had first told her the truth, sitting alone with a cup of the same burnt coffee, his hands finally fully still. She didn't say anything clever. She didn't apologize with a long speech. She simply sat down across from him and said, "I've worked beside you for 2 years, and I never once asked you a real question about who you were." "Most people don't," Marcus said. "It's easier that way, for everyone." "It's not easier for the people you saved today," she said. "It's not easier for the people you would have kept saving if half this hospital had bothered to ask you a single question in 9 years. Marcus didn't have an answer for that. He simply drank his coffee, and outside the window, the sun was coming up over the parking lot where, hours earlier, black SUVs had idled with their engines running, waiting for a man the United States government had quietly decided didn't exist anymore. He would go home that morning, sleep for a few hours, and come back for his next shift, because that was the only life he knew how to build for himself. Quiet, careful, devoted to people who would never fully understand what it cost him to stand calmly at the foot of their beds, while the worst memories of his life replayed behind his eyes. But something had shifted, almost imperceptibly, in the way the staff looked at him now. Sarah, Tomas, and Priya didn't treat him like furniture anymore. They treated him like a man who had, without raising his voice once, without ever asking for credit, held an entire hospital together, with his bare hands, while everyone around him panicked. A week later, a small package arrived for him at the nurse's station. No return address, delivered by a courier who didn't wait for a signature. Inside was a single object, a worn, faded unit patch, the same shape and size as the one he had once worn on a uniform he was never legally allowed to describe to anyone, stitched with a symbol that meant nothing to anyone who looked at it without the right clearance, and everything to the 12 people who had once worn it together. 11 of them were gone. He was the 12th. He held the patch in his enormous, careful hands for a long moment, and then he tucked it into his scrub pocket, the same pocket where, 9 years ago, he had started keeping the small private pieces of a life he thought he had buried for good. He didn't tell anyone what it was. He never would. But the next time a new resident dismissed him in the hallway, assuming the quiet nurse in the oversized scrubs had nothing worth listening to, Marcus simply nodded, said understood, and went back to work. Because some people earn the right to know who you really are, and most people never will, and the ones who matter, the dying and the desperate and the 4 people who walked out of that sealed wing alive because of him, already knew exactly who he was, even if his name never made it into a single official report. If Marcus's hidden strength and quiet sacrifice moved you, hit that like button and share this story with someone who needs a reminder that the quietest people in the room are often carrying the heaviest weight. Subscribe to The Last Nurse for more gripping stories of hidden heroes who hide their scars behind hospital scrubs and step forward only when the world is on the brink of falling apart. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Marcus's shoes? Stay tuned for the next story.